All right, it's day 10. Welcome back. And we have two of our favorite humans, Kylene Beers and Bob Probst, with us today. If you watched us 30 plus conversations a year ago, they were star guests, just incredible humans and teachers. I think that, Forged by Reading is what we're going to talk about today, of the many Kylene and Bob books that are stacked behind me. But more than that, I don't know how many people know that you both have served in national organizations, that you've served at the highest levels of making decisions with people who make decisions for huge bodies of kids, right? So as an ELA supervisor, Bob, and as an NCTE president during the time of Common Core, Kylene, these are people who've made change and have supported always teachers. Anyone who has picked up Forged by Reading, the newest, The Power of a Literate Life, has to have been moved by your opening note to teachers. Have you seen how many times We Turn to You has been posted somewhere on Facebook or Twitter? And I was hoping one of you would start us off by reading that to teachers.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. But you don't want the whole thing read, do you? Or do
Just
you?
that first paragraph that ends with
That first paragraph. Well, that's a Bob thing to do.
No, you read it, Kylene.
No, Bob's going to read it. Go for it.
No, Kylene's going to read it. All right. Today, dear teachers, as with each today, we turn to you. We have said before, and now say again louder and with even more conviction. As teachers, we proudly stand beside you, but as parents, we stand in awe of all that you do. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you. You withstand the fires of uncertainty, of fear, of inequities. You show the nation that teachers always respond to their students no matter the situation. Thank you.
I asked you to start with that because just this morning I got a note from a Book Love grant recipient who said that at the end of this school year, she's going to turn off everything, disconnect from everything, and spend the entire summer away from everything education, simply because she is so tired.
Yes.
And I appreciate that you recognize the kind of work that teachers do.
You know, Penny, everything we've done with teachers this year, we've started with giving them a chance to talk about how they're coping and feeling. And while there's always positive comments about such excitement to work with the kids that show up, such desire to help any kid any way they can, they eventually do get underneath to, I am so tired, I am so weary, I am so anxious, so frustrated, so overwhelmed, so exhausted. And they're exhausted because they refuse to do less. You know, that there's a real easy way not to be exhausted, just do less. And that never enters a teacher's mind. You know, I could feel okay. I could just kind of skirt through this year, but they're not. They're working 10 times as hard. So we really felt very strongly that Forged by Reading had to begin with a thank you. It's true every year that we ought to thank teachers, but it's particularly true the year of the pandemic.
Absolutely.
I think the theme of the book, you know, one of the themes of the book too is that the time for this book, for teachers to read some of the central messages of this book, is long overdue, right? It feels, and I mean this as a compliment, it feels different than some of your other books.
How's that, Kelly? Where did you feel that?
Lines like, answering questions is not the same thing as questioning answers. We can teach kids how viruses are different from bacteria, but we avoid discussing why the healthcare system better serves the wealthy than the poor. That teachers often take refuge in irrelevance.
Yeah,
it feels very different to me than when kids can't read. Right.
Or even notice a note. Yeah.
Right.
Bob, don't you think that this was very purposeful to write a different book and it didn't just emerge as a different book?
Yes, I think we we started thinking that, started off our thinking about the teaching of reading by wondering how you got kids interested, how you got them involved, how you got them committed to the process. And the more and more we went through the last several years, the more we began to think, not only do we have to get them interested, we have to get them to recognize that what they are doing is significant, that it has implications, that they have to do it responsibly. Witnessing the tremendously irresponsible use of language in the public sphere made us realize that we possibly had not stepped as hard on that issue as we should have. So Forged by Reading is an effort to get readers to look at what they are doing and to realize that they shape themselves through the process of reading a text. By shaping themselves, they shape their interactions with others. By shaping their interactions with others, they shape the society. By shaping the society, they shape the world. I guess that points out my only slight dissatisfaction with the title was that it doesn't emphasize enough that the reader shapes him or herself. Mm-hmm. It suggests that reading shapes you, which is too easily translated, the book shapes you. But the book doesn't or shouldn't shape you. You should be the agent. You should make the decision about what you believe, what you will value, what you trust, and move from there.
You know, Kelly, when Scholastic approached us, they asked us to write a book that would be about how to set up in your classroom an independent reading program. Mm-hmm. And so we said, well, let's look at the books that, talk about that. And as we looked around, we thought, wow, there are some that sort of talk about it. There are some, like we could go back to Nancy Atwell's with, in the middle, is there a more iconic book on how to set up a reader's workshop, which to me, that's what independent reading is all about. And we began to question, why would we be doing that? But then we really began to question how quickly the nation has embraced independent reading as a program. It's got steps to it. You buy books, you decide how you're going to categorize them, you decide how many minutes you're going to read a day, you figure out if kids are going to use a log or not, you talk about how they'll get them home, how they'll bring them back. It became a thing. And we decided that didn't interest us at all. There are lots of people who can better discuss the critical components of getting books into a room, into a kid's hand, and then back out of the locker. We were more interested in what does it really mean to be an independent reader? And when we just Googled independent reader, of the 410,000 comments that came up.
So it was into the millions, well into the millions.
Probably. In a nanosecond, the majority were about, because Kelly, we read all of them. We read all 410 million comments. Yeah, we did that. So of the 12 that we looked at, they were really all talking about reaching a fluency level, or something about your zone of proximal development, or something about automaticity, or something about moving from this level with naming any person who's level to text to that next level. And that wasn't it. We were talking about what happens when you become independent because you don't need other people to tell you what to think.
You may need other people to help you, but you don't need them to tell you. And as we worked on this, I began to think that independence was in conflict often with affiliation. A lot of people approach texts and events through whatever they are affiliated with. Thus, the Democrat speaks like other Democrats. The Republican speaks like other Republicans. The policeman may speak like other policemen and think like other policemen. What we have needed occasionally is the policeman or the teacher or the Republican who would say, wait a minute, that statement you have made may be politically correct in our little affiliated group, but it lacks evidence or logic. If one of the several policemen who watched the killing of George Floyd had said, hey, wait a minute, this may not be a good idea, maybe we would not have murdered that man on the streets. So we need a reader who will back off not only from we need a reader who will back off from his group, his religious, political, other affiliations, and who will say, let's take a look at the evidence involved. Let's take a look at the rationale of the position we are holding. And that's sort of why we wrote Forged by Reading, because we wanted to emphasize the importance of the individual's role in forging who he becomes, shaping who he becomes.
I think
it was very purposeful, Kelly. It was very purposeful. It was a decision probably made while we were writing Disrupting Thinking, that we knew there was going to be one book beyond it to, if Disrupting Thinking talked about some things that ought to be happening in classrooms, Forged by Reading talks about things that ought to be happening within the individual. And we knew we wanted to go that next step. We just didn't know when we were going to get to it.
You know, years ago, I heard Jeff Wilhelm talk about how English teachers often are too narrow in their definition when they teach kids when they're reading a book about setting. You know, that setting is not just time and place, but the setting is the time and the place of the writer,
right,
that the writer was sitting in that chair. And it just feels like, in a good way, this book was so deeply influenced by the events that were going on. And, you know, kind of reminds me, Penny and I were just talking last week about the danger of Bob, of readers always staying in their lanes and never getting out of their lanes.
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, I was thinking, if you were talking, Bob, that I appreciate really deep thinkers. Both of you do this all the time. You don't just stay satisfied with your work, but you go back and you go, what is it? That other thing we want to talk about. But the assumption, or I maybe took it as an assumption that you made at the start, that independent reading has kind of taken off as a program, is not at all what I see in high schools. It is still rare for a high school teacher to give students choice in what they read. And I just wonder what you guys would say about that, because you don't know how many online sessions and conversations I have where teachers would be like, well, that would be fine, but they can do that on their own because I have my curriculum and I have my, what would you say about that? Why does it matter that kids make choices and have time to read at their own rate and in their own way?
If I could jump in very quickly, I would say it matters because most of the reading we do for the rest of our lives will be independent and on our own. When I'm sitting on a plane reading a book, I don't have anybody to talk with about it. I need some training and practice in how I might think about a text that I am confronting independently. Plus, the other consideration is that the books that I read after I get out of the grip of the teacher are going to be independently chosen. I need to learn how to occasionally resist and occasionally accept them. I need to learn how to deal independently with texts that I have chosen, because I'm going to be doing that all of my life.
Kylene? You know, Bob, what I would add to that is, I think, Penny, that's why we spent a lot of time in Forged by Reading talking about what happens when someone becomes a reader, when someone recognizes himself or herself in the book, and or recognizes that they're not there, but there's another person that they've never experienced. So they're either reading themselves or reading beyond themselves. And from that, so two big golden retrievers just came in here to join me. So if you hear them panting, and if you're panting in the background in my study, that's what's going on. It's not that someone's sitting here hanging on to every word I'm saying. Panting in delight. Go fellas. The book, the book really probably, now that you've said that, does make a presumption that people understand the power of reading. But it also doesn't make that presumption, because we focus on that quite a bit. And when we get to that chapter that talks about independent reading, we approach it from a whole different standpoint. You know, the Q&A chapter on independent reading, when it says, how many books do you need? You need a lot. We're not going to get caught up in the weeds of, do you need 5 books per kids or 10 books per kids? What we're going to say to high school teachers over and over and over again is, if we are still reading 1 book for 6 weeks, then we have not only done a disservice about reading, but we have absolutely misunderstood what education is about. And I think that that's a debate worth having in this country. Have we misunderstood what an education is supposed to be about? I am to the point that I'm angry that 11th and 12th graders are basically treated the same way as 3rd and 4th graders. They're still supposed to show up with a backpack. They're supposed to still sit in a desk. They're supposed to still be told which class to go to from point to point to point. They are not being prepared to become active members of the community in which they live. And so, you know, where I'm really ready to go to next is, what the hell are we doing in education? Because we're doing the same thing that we've done since about 1950. We're just doing it with technology, but we're doing the same thing.
Maybe that's why you had this book sectioned into change, power, and hope, which I thought was brilliant and created such an important arc between what is wrong, what it means, and what are we going to do, right? This is, it flows so perfectly to, you cannot continue to do the same thing always.
And you know, I want to talk about the flow for just 1 second, because one thing that was so interesting for us in this book is the order of the chapters changed dramatically as we were writing. Like, I really would love to come back and circle back with y'all at some point to look at how this book was written, because the flow of a book, which matters a tremendous amount to me. I really am looking for a beginning, a middle, and end, not just a series of chapters that logically follow each other. And we changed the order, not by switching chapters 4 and 5. I mean, the conclusion became chapter 1 kind of things. So it was a very interesting and purposeful writing adventure, maybe more purposeful than, say, like Notice and Note, which sort of wrote itself. You know, if you talked about contrast and contradictions, next you need to talk about a different one. And this one this was the hardest book the two of us have ever written together. It was without a doubt the hardest collaborative effort.
I think
Bob was in a bad mood.
Well, I was going to leap back to something Kelly said a minute ago when he talked about the setting being not only the setting within the pages of the book, but the time and place of the author who wrote it. It's also, the setting is also the time and place of the reader who reads it. It's awfully hard today to read anything that has to do with issues of race without recognizing that George Floyd is part of the setting in which we're reading this. We now have to take into consideration. Sometimes it's painful to look back on the ways in which I have read. Sometimes it's let me start this over. Sometimes it's painful for me to look back on the ways in which I have read and reacted to texts because I was as naive as I was at that time about issues that I have since learned to pay attention to. And so I accepted things. I didn't see them. It was like the water the fish swims in, the air that I breathe. It's just there. It's just around me. It's part of my world. And all of a sudden I look at it and I say, doesn't have to be part of my world. I can modify or I can reject that. Part of independent reading and part of freedom of choice, it seems to me, is paying attention not just to what you want to read, but to what you really need to read, ought to read. I came home last night from this trip thinking, I sure don't want to catch up on the news. I really don't want to turn it on. And thinking that's irresponsible. I really need to know what's going on. So part of independence was saying to myself, don't be a lazy son of a gun. Go ahead, turn it on, try to, pick up the newspaper, try to catch up on what you have missed for 7 days. Independence has obligations with it. Freedom has responsibilities that imply you got to do something. You got to pay attention to something.
Which in a teaching world, we have to pay attention to what our students are choosing to read. And part of what I always talk to teachers about is nudging them beyond where they're comfortable. You can't let a kid read Pretty Little Liars all year. You want to help them find important things they want to know more about. And so I appreciate that you're kind of adding some depth to the term independent reading. I think that's really critically important. So it does bring to the obvious question, don't you think? What are you guys reading? That was one of our questions. So what are you reading right now?
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I have finally gotten around to reading Ian Toll's, the third volume of his history of the war in the Pacific. It's fascinating, tremendously detailed account. If you didn't have some interest in that, it would just drown you in facts and figures. But it's a fascinating account, and it's what I read on the plane out and back, and I still have a couple of plane rides left before I'm finished.
Plane rides of reading.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people that will admit that my reading life this year of the pandemic has suffered some. Mm-hmm. I have oftentimes found it very difficult to be concentrating. And so during the first several months of the pandemic, I guess through July or maybe August, Bob and I were doing a phenomenal amount of reading for Writing Forged by Reading. So there was a lot of academic reading that we were doing. And after that, I would find if I went to pick up a book, I had so many worries happening with me that here I am, this inveterate reader who wants to encourage everyone to read. And I have to be honest and tell you that sometimes my reading were the closed captions on the cooking channel. So that's sort of where I lived for a bit. Mm-hmm. However, I am slowly moving back into this sense of I have the cognitive energy to stick with something. So I've started reading this book. It's titled An Elegant Defense, and it's about how our immune system works. And what I'm always looking for books that are really afar from the education world to make the connection. And this is how something that doesn't know what it's going to fight. Is it COVID? Is it cancer? Is it a cold? Doesn't have any idea what it's going to fight, and yet it's put into the middle of the fight. And I often think of teachers, not with fighting, but they have no idea what a kid's going to bring every day. Mm-hmm. Every day. I mean, every day it's the same kid, but it's a very different kid. Mm-hmm. And you're put into the middle of it, and how do you do it? So I'm reading that one, and I'm also reading The Molecule of More. And I love this one. The subtitle really says it all. How a single chemical in your brain drives love, sex, and creativity and will determine the fate of the human race. So the molecule of more connects to education with me because I don't think we've done enough with creativity. And I don't mean as in let's go read Paul Torrance and learn how to teach creativity for 20 minutes. I mean looking at thinking as a creative endeavor. And it's back to what Marianne Wolf and Bob and I had the delightful surprise of getting to talk on Zoom with Marianne Wolf the other day.
Which has driven me back to both her books, Proust and the Squid. I can't find the other one.
Well, this one
lying around, and to this this wonderful series, the Literary Agenda, Oxford Press. Oh well, I can't show it to you, but it's a series of very small volumes about poetry, the novel as a survival skill, reading and the reader, everyday stories. Interesting collection of texts.
So our reading lives have been different this year, and I think that might be true for a lot of people.
Yeah, it really has.
I mean, I feel like we've just scratched the surface on Forged by Reading. You know, this whole idea, I'm really intrigued by many other ideas we didn't get to today. This idea of how do we encourage kids to seek the views of others, which Bob kind of touched on a little bit. I just, you know, I think, you know, it's such a breath of fresh air when it's a book that's not about curriculum. It's about what are you going to be as a thoughtful adult? And if, you know, and again, I'll come back to that line, you know, that teachers sometimes take refuge in irrelevance, and it's time in a changing world to change the way we're approaching the ELA classroom. We have ended our sessions with a little bit of quick fire, random lightning round questions. Penny, do you want to go?
All right. What was your first car, Kylene?
It was a Monte Carlo with that long front end. I absolutely loved my Monte Carlo. Yes.
How about you, Bob?
Mine was a Model T Ford. I'm not that old, really. No, mine was a Plymouth convertible that my aunt gave me. It was very old. Stick shifts, you know, on the column, not on the floor, but dark blue. Nice. Wonderful car. Learned how to downshift in that car. Yeah,
who gets a convertible first?
That's awesome. Took me about an hour and a half to get the top down or up. So I didn't. I had to watch the weather. It's where I would have fallen in love with the Weather Channel had there been computers at that time.
Kylene, tell us one thing about Bob most people don't know.
Oh God.
I'm sorry, this is PG, just so we are clear.
One thing about Bob that most people don't know. Bob is often seen in conferences or even like this today in a dress shirt. And in conferences, he is most often seen in a suit and a tie. And when I first started working with him, he had no idea that anyone ever wore something to give a keynote speech at a major conference other than blue jeans and just like a pullover shirt. And I remember saying to him early in our career, we are speaking to 1,000 superintendents at some national convention. I said, these men will, and they were men, will all be in suits. You have to wear a suit. And he said, like, what kind of suit? He didn't even know what a suit was. And so I convinced him to start wearing suits. And now I'm saying to him, Bob, you can show up for this after dinner party in blue jeans and a sports coat. Oh no, I need to wear a suit. So I have created a suit monster now. And yeah, well,
Yeah.
So
Most
Bob,
people
Some of
never
what she
visit
says
that
is
house.
true. Part of most of my transition to suits is due to Kylene's browbeating. I started to say influence, but it was she carries a whip. An old
Bob, I'm going to
guy.
cut in here and I'm going to cut in here and save some misery for later. Bob, tell us one thing about Kylene most people do not know.
I don't think they know that she is such a good cook. I don't know. Maybe some of them do, but marvelous cook. She and I think she loves it too. She goes to the kitchen and just whips together stuff easily that seems like it came out of an extremely fancy restaurant. I don't know how she does that.
That's
Great.
very nice, Bob. Thank you.
Well,
Okay, last question for each of you. What are you binging?
wait a minute. I'm sorry. You broke up momentarily.
You won't know what this means.
What?
binge watching.
Kylene, you go first. What have you been binge watching?
So sort of in no particular order, Schitt's Creek, which I absolutely did not understand why anyone liked for the first 4 or 5. And by the end of it, I am sobbing with joy that this show was made. I just discovered something that people knew a decade ago. There's a show called Parenthood, which, I'm usually about a decade late. And so I've been going a lot through that. And then seriously, every single show on how to fix a house, though I'm never going to fix a house on my own. So that's my binge watching.
It's a good article in the Current New Yorker on HGTV. It's really good.
I'll look for it.
Bob, what have you been watching?
Well, most recently, I've been watching a series called "Tell Me a Lie." I don't know if you've seen that. I think it's on Hulu, but it's funny, very entertaining. It is about a man who has studied facial expressions, including what he has called micro expressions, those little curls of the lips and raises of the eyebrows that take place in a very split second to reveal that you are telling the truth, telling a lie, that you're fearful, that you're ashamed, that you're whatever. Fascinating, funny program.
Penny, please never watch that. Thank you.
I'm going to leave my Zoom screen off when I talk to Bob from now on.
Oh my goodness.
Well, what a treat it was. What a treat it was for us. Your work over the years, even though you're in the same relative age group that I am, your work over the years is just, there's no words really, that you've been a central part of the national and international conversation. And it's a pinch me moment that I'm sitting here talking to you. As friends and as colleagues. And so I want to thank you so very much for coming on. I know Penny, you feel the same way.
Oh my gosh. I can
Thank
remember
you.
being in the back of the room at NCTE, the two of you speaking when I was only attending as a teacher and just trying to write down everything you said, just kept stopping to think, where did they come up with all of these great ideas, all of these insights into teaching and learning? So you have been guides for me forever.
If you have not read Forged by Reading, this should be moved to the top of your professional reading list. We recommend it very highly. Bob, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you.
loved it. We loved it. Hope to see you both in person real soon.
I know.
Take care.